Editio Critica Maior 1, The Gospel According to Matthew, a guide for professors and their students. First, allow me to commend the team at the Institute for New Testament Textual Research for their significant progress on this massive project, especially for those whose dedication to the study of the Gospel of Matthew is matched by a keen interest in textual studies. The ECM will be both an essential and the most valuable resource. Nowhere else can we find such an enormously helpful array of tools for the study of the text of the early church's most beloved gospel. My assigned topic for this session is the use of Editio Critica Maior Matthew in classroom instruction. So my specific focus will be the scholars of the Matthew section of the Society for Biblical Literature joining us, who may not have worked extensively with the previous volumes of the ECM and its related tools. I will briefly discuss some of the ways that I instruct students in the use of ECM Matthew in advanced exegesis and textual criticism courses, and along the way provide a general orientation to the resources related to the ECM. Presently, the ECM will interest students and Matthean scholars primarily because of the new initial text that it presents. The ECM offers 16 new initial readings compared to the NA 28. According to my analysis, 4 of the 16 new initial readings are exegetically significant. The most obvious of these is Matthew 16, 2b through 3, especially since this text contains the longest variant in Matthew shared by multiple witnesses. This passage provides an excellent opportunity for students to learn to read the apparatus, explore the tools developed for the ECM, and see how additional study of many variant units is still needed. We can access ECM Matthew online at the New Testament Virtual Manuscript Room website by clicking ECM, then entering Matthew 16:2 in the quick lookup box. Our variant unit begins at position 12. So we will scroll down the page to locate that variant unit in the apparatus. Students will probably need to be reminded of the significance of the abbreviations and symbols in the apparatus. The downward arrow calls attention to what follows, since this numerical address includes other variations treated below. The different variants in this unit are enumerated with the letters of the alphabet. The abbreviation OM for omission indicates that the witnesses in this attestation omit Matthew 16, 2b through 3. The parenthetical references show parallel text, first in Matthew, then in other Gospels, which lack the material in reading B. The R with O5 represents regularization, since O5 supports the reading but with negligible differences. The V for videtur with O32 signals here that the reading in O32 is incomplete, the result of parablepsis caused by the scribe skipping from the first to the second gar in the longer reading. The C with 543, 826, and 1502 indicates that this reading is inserted as a correction, although the V with 826 indicates that the support is only apparent, in this case because at some point the page was trimmed and the first few letters of each line of the correction were cut off. With this general orientation, we are ready to begin using the ECM tools and the application of reasoned eclecticism. Reasoned eclecticism ordinarily begins with an evaluation of external evidence. We prefer readings that can be shown to be early. To assess the antiquity of each reading, students should compose a table with the witnesses for each attestation arranged by century. Although the proposed dates for each witness will be given in Part 2 supplementary material of the printed volumes, the online ECM Matthew allows students to access the dates easily. In the online ECM apparatus, press Shift and hover the cursor over a specific witness to display 3 new buttons. Clicking on the gold star will highlight the witness throughout the entire ECM apparatus. Clicking the arrow will open this section of the apparatus in a new text box with that witness highlighted. But clicking the I information button will automatically display the manuscript details. In the online liste, including the commonly accepted date for the artifact. Sometimes the date for a reading can be traced even earlier than the earliest manuscript that contains it, based on patristic evidence. If one compares the ECM apparatus to the UBS text, it may appear that the apparatus has overlooked important patristic references. In fact, it has not. Although Origen is cited as evidence for reading A and other critical editions, I argued in my first article on this specific variant unit, New Testament Studies 2020, we cannot be confident Origen's text contained reading A, since Origen skips other passages in his treatment, even though those passages are present in all extant manuscripts. The ECM wisely dropped Origen as a patristic witness to reading A. The UBS 5 listed manuscripts according to Jerome as witnesses to reading A, and Juvencus, Hilary, Jerome, and Augustine as witnesses to reading B. These were eliminated since the apparatus contains only Greek fathers or other fathers who clearly used a Greek exemplar. Thus, Chrysostom appears as the only patristic evidence for reading B. The INTF has provided yet another convenient tool for probing the patristic evidence. This tool enables the user to search patristic references to specific verses of the New Testament. The testimony of Chrysostom suggests that we can trace reading B to the late 4th century. However, we must keep in mind that our critical edition of Chrysostom's homilies on Matthew is based on manuscripts from the 11th century and later. But to demonstrate the patristics tool, I must use an example from Mark, since the Matthew data is not currently available. Clicking the numeric entry will reveal the Greek quotation and provide bibliographical information for the critical edition of the patristic work from which the quotation is taken. The question mark before the title of the writing indicates that the attribution to this assigned author is dubious. This tool has several helpful features. First, the specific citation is underlined. Differences from the text of the attestation are indicated with bold type, and differences in word order are marked with italics. Omissions and additions are also indicated. That leads us to our next step in the process of reasoned eclecticism, which will be to reevaluate the date assigned to readings shared by early witnesses from various regions. Assessing early geographical distribution of the reading relies primarily on patristic and versional evidence, since the provenance of our early manuscripts is often unknown. Again, ECM Matthew, unlike the UBS text, does not include the Latin fathers, except for Tertullian, since he used a Greek exemplar for his own translations, and therefore can be considered a witness to the Greek tradition. The exclusion of Latin patristic evidence, though appropriate, often significantly reduces the number of citations that may be used in assessing geographical distribution. Thus, assessment of geographical distribution will be more heavily dependent now on versional evidence. The versional evidence shows that reading A was prevalent in Egypt, as attested by the substantial number of Sahidic and Bohairic Coptic manuscripts, as well as 2 Middle Egyptian witnesses. 3 Old Syriac texts also support reading A. Reading B has extensive geographical distribution as attested by support from both Bohairic Coptic, Old Latin, and Vulgate manuscripts. However, the versional evidence does not indicate that a wide geographical distribution was early enough to suggest that either reading significantly predates its earliest extant witnesses. The next step in our process is to reevaluate the date assigned to readings shared by early witnesses that are not closely related to each other. When we begin to examine textual relationships, we will turn to the tools in the CBGM used to develop the ECM. On the NTG page, you will find the program suite for the CBGM. Now, the presenters for this SBL session have been given pre-publication access to CBGM Matthew, but only as a work in progress. After the edition is in print, the CBGM for Matthew will be open for everyone to use. To access it, we click on the button for Project Matthew Phase 3.0 and then click Coherence and Textual Flow. We'll then enter the scripture reference, in this case Matthew 16:2. We'll then click on the text box that immediately follows the slash. A drop-down menu will appear that lists the variant units, and we will select 2/12 through 3/46 to display the apparatus for our variant unit. The CBGM contains an apparatus which is similar to the ECM, but still distinct in several features. First, notice that the apparatus is conveniently color-coded, and this color coding is immensely helpful for assessing textual relationships using some of the related tools. Second, notice that this apparatus does not include patristic or versional evidence. In addition, the CBGM apparatus does not display the reading of correctors. However, it identifies significantly more Greek text than the ECM apparatus does. This is not accidental. The ECM identifies witnesses with at least 90% agreement with the majority text as Byzantine witnesses and represents them with the symbol BYZ in bold font to keep the apparatus in the printed volume a reasonable length, although there is now a style display option in the digital ECM that will display the larger apparatus. Since the text critical criterion we are applying relates to early witnesses, we may focus on just the three majuscules in that first attestation. If we click on the Gregory Allen number 03, we can see the closest relatives of Vaticanus listed in descending order. We'll find that 01 agrees with Vaticanus in 89.34% of variant units and is its second closest relative. However, 033 agrees with Vaticanus in 85.49% of readings and with 01 in only 83.24% of readings. To see levels of agreement on a chapter-by-chapter comparison, click on the scale icon on the right-hand side of the page. The resulting table can be helpful for identifying block mixture, in which the copyist used two or more different exemplars with a different textual complexion consecutively. First one, then another, perhaps back again, as we find in manuscripts such as 032. Both 03 and 01 agree more frequently with the majority text, 88% and 86% respectively, than with 033. However, since 033 dates to the 10th century and thus is not an early witness, the criterion does not support dating the reading significantly earlier than its two 4th century witnesses, 01 and 03. However, when we examine relationships between the earliest artifacts for reading B, 04, 05, 032, we get very different results. 04 and 032 agree 89.8% of the time. Both 04 and 032 agree significantly more with the majority text than with each other, 93% and 94% respectively. And 04 and 05 agree in only 78% of variant units. 032 and 05 agree only 77.82% of variant units. So unless we find evidence that the agreement is coincidental as the result of multiple emergence, the agreement of these 5th century manuscripts whose texts are not closely related suggests that we may trace the reading significantly earlier to at least the 4th century, the era of the earliest witnesses to reading A. And this confirms the evidence we found in the citation of reading B in Chrysostom. Next, we'll prefer readings and witnesses that are known to be reliable and accurate. The ECM also assists with evaluating the quality of the witnesses in each attestation. Rather than relying on the old Allen categories, Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2, to measure reliability, which by the way confused their original purpose and was not based on a comprehensive assessment, Tommy Wasserman has wisely recommended that we assess the quality of a text by its similarity to the initial text. The CBGM data developed in the preparation of the ECM makes this simple. To find the witnesses in each attestation most closely related to the initial text, scroll to the bottom of the Coherence and Textual Flow page to find General Textual Flow. This is a section of the textual flow diagram of Matthew developed by the application of the CBGM. Initially, using the default settings, the textual flow assumes that the text of an extant artifact is the ultimate source from which all other texts derive. However, by clicking A, the symbol for the Ausgangstext, we make the initial text of the ECM the hypothetical ultimate ancestor. In the new textual flow, the second tier of witnesses identifies the text that are the first potential descendants of the initial text. Each of the witnesses in that second tier has more prior readings than the ones on the third tier, and the third tier witnesses have more prior readings than ones on the fourth tier, and so on. Notice that 3 of these witnesses in the first tier support reading A. 9 of these witnesses support reading B. By clicking on ZU:(A), we can see the witnesses most closely related to the initial text. The color coding used in the apparatus identifies the attestation each witness supports. In this case, the witnesses in blue support reading A, and the witnesses in green support reading B. The table reveals the precise level of pre-genealogical coherence, general agreement, between each witness and the initial text on all shared variant units. Again, we can display the level of agreement for each chapter of Matthew by clicking that scale icon on the far right-hand side of the table. You'll notice that some of these most reliable and accurate witnesses did not appear in the ECM apparatus. This, again, is because the ECM groups witnesses with a text agreeing with the majority text on at least 90% of variant units under that symbol BYZ for Byzantine. However, the features of the CBGM enable us to see that some of these so-called Byzantine witnesses are of a very high quality, indicated by their impressive level of agreement with the initial text. For example, although 892, 1582, 33, 1, 2737, and 1192 did not appear in the ECM apparatus due to their close agreement with the majority text, they are more similar to the initial text than any majuscule, including 01, with the single exception of 03, the initial text closest relative. The data at the top of the page explains their absence from the ECM apparatus. The initial text agrees with the majority text in 93% of the variant units for which the majority text is defined. In other words, the initial text has such a high level of agreement with the majority text that if the initial text belonged to an extant artifact, it too would have been classified as Byzantine in the apparatus of the ECM. The table shows that minuscule 892 has the initial text as its first potential ancestor and agrees with the initial text and 5,927 out of 6,302 passages, or 94.05% of shared variant units. These texts, with the Ausgangstext as their first potential ancestor, should be classified among the most reliable and accurate witnesses, and their testimony should be carefully considered in the evaluation of the external evidence. Our next question is, which reading best explains the origin of other readings? Westcott and Hort's famous second principle is, all trustworthy restoration of corrupted texts is founded on the study of their history, that is, of the relations of descent or affinity which connect the several documents. The primary goal of the CVGM is to identify these relations of descent, that is, the CVGM's genealogical coherence, or affinity, that is, the CVGM's pre-genealogical coherence. Westcott and Hort summarized the principle in the caption atop the pages of this section of their introduction. They wrote, "Use of plurality of documents demands knowledge of genealogy." Several tools supporting the ECM may provide supporting evidence for determining which reading best explains the origin of other readings in a textual genealogy. First, the editors provide a local stemma displaying their view of the relationship between the various readings. This stemma depicts reading A as derived from the initial text, signified by the asterisk, and readings B and C as independently derived from some unknown source. Other modules enable us to assess the evidence for this reconstruction. We could begin by examining the relations of descent depicted in the general textual flow to see how often a potential ancestor with reading A has an immediate descendant with reading B, and vice versa. However, we can conduct this examination far more quickly and easily by using the Coherence at Variant Passages module. This module shows pairs of witnesses which are potentially an ancestor and descendant, and yet support two different variants. The directional arrow indicates the nature of the relationship by pointing from potential ancestor to potential descendant. In these cases, we would expect the ancestor to preserve the prior reading and suspect that the other variant is the product of contamination or perhaps a scribal error. The connectivity setting for this module is 5 by default. This means that the 5 most probable extant ancestors of the descendant are considered. If we set the connectivity to 1 by sliding the circle, the graph will include pairs in which the proposed ancestor is the most probable ancestor, rather than one of the top 5 candidates. And yet the descendant supports that different reading. Generally, I recommend leaving the connectivity at the default setting of 5, since often the top rankings vary only by fractions of a percentage. The graphic indicates that 3 texts with reading B have potential ancestors with reading A, and yet 5 texts with reading A have potential ancestors with reading B. We should not be bothered by the 2 on 2 of the lines of descent. This simply indicates that the identified ancestor is the second most probable extant ancestor. However, in both of these cases, the most probable ancestor is minuscule 509, which is lacunos for this passage. Though lacunos, the textual relationships strongly suggest that 509 contained reading B. The textual relationships suggest a higher probability that for these pairs of witnesses, B is the prior reading, and reading A in these witnesses is either the result of contamination or intentional omission for some reason. The Coherence and Attestations module is helpful for assessing what Gerd Mink has called coherent chains. This premise guides the assessment. If a witness to a specific reading does not have a close relative that shares that same reading, this broken link in the chain suggests that the variant has arisen more than once, multiple emergence resulting in coincidental agreement. The module shows that the attestation for reading A lacks coherence. There are many breaks in the coherence chain. 5 of the witnesses to reading A have probable ancestors that contain reading B. In order to find coherence within the attestation, I must set the connectivity to all and allow some witnesses to rely on their 5th, 15th, 19th, 22nd, 23rd, and even 26th most likely potential ancestor. To assess the coherence of the attestation for reading B, we must change that variant by clicking on the button on the far left of the module and selecting B. The attestation for reading B has significantly greater coherence. At the high connectivity of 2, the attestation has complete coherence except for an interesting variation within family 13. At the connectivity of 8, the attestation has complete coherence. Although larger attestations will generally have greater coherence than smaller attestations, the far greater coherence in the attestation for reading B should be carefully considered in establishing the initial text. Our next step will be to explore other potentially relevant information. My students are required to consult manuscript images in addition to the online transcriptions, especially for the earliest witnesses to the various readings. This variant reading, variant unit, provides an excellent example of the importance of that step. In the ECM apparatus, simply click on the GA number for a witness to reveal a transcription of the pertinent text of the manuscript. If you then click on the page image box, it will display a high-resolution photograph of the pertinent page of the artifact. In this case, the astute student who examines images of O1 will hopefully note the paratextual features that suggest that although O1 is a witness to reading A, its exemplar contained reading B. And this serves to confirm the previous findings that the two readings, A and B, are of equal antiquity as far as one can tell from the extant evidence. The online ECM helpfully streamlines this process for consulting the artifacts for further study. Our limited time does not permit exploration of the full usefulness of the ECM and its tools in the practice of textual criticism. But hopefully, this brief presentation has sufficiently demonstrated the great value of these resources. As a Matthean scholar with great interest in textual criticism, I do not think it's an exaggeration to claim that ECM Matthew and its related tools will be the most important contribution to the scholarly study of this gospel in the 21st century. Orienting students to these resources is challenging, and the initial learning curve may seem steep. But their research will be impoverished if they fail to utilize this text and its helpful tools. Exegesis of the gospel is foundational to the entire field of Matthean studies, and the first step in exegesis is establishing the text of the gospel. Thus, both hearty congratulations and deep felt gratitude are owed to the editors, programmers, transcribers, and all who contributed in other ways to this valuable gift to the Academy.